Welcome back. Last time we watched while a Dutch colonel raised his whiskey glass together with the men who had just overthrown the Surinamese government in a toast at his own farewell party. We tracked how three men who shared a judo mat in the late 1960s, where one would train the dictator, another one would flee the country the day of the coup, and there was a third one who fled and only emerged later in the resistance movement, where he would reappear yet again at Bauduza's trial in the early 2012s or 2009s. Then we met Peter Meyer, who was a counterintelligence officer who found the smoking gun in a filing cabinet, and he documented everything, and he ended up in a car crash mysteriously at the edge of the road in Delft before he could tell anybody what he knew. And we established that there was a central question of this entire investigation, which was the 1980 coup by Suriname sergeants a spontaneous uprising, or was it a product of deliberate cultivation by the Dutch military network that spent years building the exact relationships that it would need? Now, if you haven't seen part one yet, I'd recommend go watching that now. The link is down in the description. What we're about to show you, it lands the way it should if you understand what came before. Because part two is where we're going to get all forensic. We're going to check out what happened the 4 days leading up to the coup, the intelligence that Colonel Valk withheld, the ambassador whose departure route, at least his stated departure route, doesn't quite match any conference that he claimed to attend. We're going to look at two senior Dutch intelligence officers who had identical alibis covering the exact same 4-hour window, both of them swearing up and down that they were back home in bed while Paramaribo was burning. And we're going to understand why it was that the armories happened to be unlocked, why broken vehicles were suddenly repaired just in the nick of time, while an American aircraft with a very specific code name were transmitting real-time updates to the Dutch embassy while the coup was in progress. And we're going to meet the man who lived next door to Colonel Hans Valk, the one who cut a hole in the fence line so the two of them could exchange intel during the coup without being seen. So this two-part episode really matters for the larger picture for one reason, because everything that follows after this, the Rambocus coup, the December murders, the CIA's intervention architecture, the Wolf Pack, the Suriname 6, the disappearing Surinamese air fleet, all of it had its roots in what happened in 1975 and 1979 and February 25th, 1980. So you really can't understand why the machinery failed in the Rambocus coup in 1982 if you don't understand how they built the machine beforehand. And you can't understand how it was built without understanding who the handlers were, the men who turned other men into weapons and called it friendship the whole time. It all starts with a 17-minute joke. And by the end of it, you're going to know exactly what the joke was all about. I'm Matthew Smith. Let's get into it. Captain Briere loved to tell a story, even while the newspapers were accusing him of engineering a coup. And it went like this. After Suriname gained independence, Colonel Valk said, "Briere, how long before we take back possession of the country again?" Briere said, "Let me think, Colonel. 15 minutes, drive over to the barracks. 2 minutes for the takeover. 17 minutes, Colonel." Briere laughed, telling the story. It was a joke like that, a complete joke. We made jokes constantly about how easy it would be to stage a coup, but we weren't thinking about it seriously. Except for on February 25th, 1980, Bauduza actually did, and it took less than 12 hours. The joke had been accurate. Now, it was the same kind of sentiment being expressed over at the American embassy staff at that time. In an interview with Charles Stewart Kennedy, former political officer Paul Good confirmed a military assessment heard from a previous ambassador, where he said, A lieutenant colonel or something came down and looked around and said, we could probably take this place over with a battalion. But then what the hell are you going to do with it? 17 minutes and a battalion. That's all it would take. And on February 25th, 1980, when Desi Bouterza and 15 other sergeants actually did it, they proved the joke was accurate. Less than 12 hours from first move to complete control. And jokes have a way of becoming blueprints when the conditions are right. The call came on February 25th, 1980. Not a week after the coup, not a month later, the same day. 2 men were placed at B1 of the security section that morning. You had Lieutenant Colonel Valdrain and Major Koenders. Their assignment was to find out what happened, what course Bouterza would follow, and the dangerous question, which is what role had the Dutch played in all of it. Now, Koenders was the right man for the job because he'd been there before. From 1970 to 1972, he'd been the head of S2 Trees, the intelligence wing of the Dutch colonial forces in Suriname. He'd built the files on these people. He knew the names, the relationship, who owed what to whom, and who could be trusted under pressure. Back in 1968 through 1975, when the Dutch still had their military presence in Suriname, the security section had officers who were stationed there. They were building networks and they were establishing relationships, creating that kind of institutional memory that doesn't evaporate just because you lower the flag at independence. So when that Independence Day came, that memory didn't just disappear. It got filed away, archived, maintained. And when Koenders walked back into Suriname in 1980, he was walking back into a building, into an apparatus that he had helped construct. So his official mandate was to assess whether the Dutch military mission had been compromised, specifically whether the men who had spent years drinking with Bouterza's NCOs had gone ideologically native. The fear wasn't just that Valk had been clumsy, the fear was the word that haunted every Cold War intelligence file. Red. Not too close to the locals red, not too sympathetic to the grievances red, Cuban red, Moscow red, the kind of red that meant the entire mission had been an unwitting pipeline for Soviet penetration, strategically located in a former colony sitting at the approaches of the southern Caribbean. So that was the kind of question that Koenders was sent to answer. And what he found was worse, not because the mission had actually gone communist, but because it had gone operational. So there's a difference here. It matters enormously. A communist infiltrator you can just disavow. You can report it to the appropriate committee. You can purge the asset. You can rebuild the apparatus. The institutional damage there is containable. It's even manageable. A foreign service doesn't die from one bad compromised officer. But what Koenders found was ideological. It was the fingerprints. It was Dutch military hands reaching into the Surinamese government, coaching a coup that removed a democratically elected government in a sovereign foreign colony. So the liability wasn't ideological like communism, it was institutional. If it survived into a parliamentary inquiry, the question wasn't going to be, why did the Dutch officers sympathize with the NCO grievances? The question was, why did Dutch military infrastructure facilitate regime change? And that question didn't have any clean answer, and it led directly to The Hague. So Koenders, he interviewed all the escaped Surinamese officers as they came through, and he talked to the former mission members, and he talked to Valk himself on July 1st, 1980 at Valk's farewell party, the same night Bouterza reportedly raised his glass and told the room that the coup wouldn't have been able to happen without him. By then, Koenders had the outline. He knew what the mission had been doing the whole time, and he knew who had done it, and he knew how they had done it. Marsevain arrived as Valk's replacement in June of 1980 and independently found the exact same pattern. So did Peter Meyer, who arrived in April 1981 as Marsevain's administrative assistant / spy, and he found Valk's handwriting on allegedly on the black Tulip document in the filing cabinet that should have been cleared out years ago. So 3 investigators, same institution, same finding, same trail. And on September 7th, 1981, when Koenders submitted his formal report, it confirmed Valk's criminal involvement in the coup. It named mission members who had surrounded him. It established with methodological precision of a career counterintelligence officer that this is not a question of speculation, this is documented fact. Colonel Schulte read the report and he said a couple words. Bergmar up, just file it away. The reason Schulte gave, the passages about Valk's involvement didn't fit the stated purpose of the investigation. A coordinating defense official put it a little bit more plainly. The new defense attaché, Bas von Tussenbroek, we'll see him as Valk 2.0, he needed to start with a clean slate. No further clouding of the relationship with the Surinamese military leadership. Operational continuity required institutional amnesia. In other words, they just needed to forget about it and move on. But 3 investigators, same institution, same finding, same suppression. So here's what makes Koenders' position worth sitting with for just a little bit. Here's a man who had spent his whole career studying vetting failures, meaning how the wrong people got inside of trusted networks, how legitimate resistance organizations got compromised, and how an institution's memory could be the thing that either prevented catastrophe or enabled it. So he'd seen what happened when the people inside of a network stopped being accountable to the network's purpose and they started protecting their own positions instead. He had spent a whole decade building the Surinamese files precisely so this wouldn't happen. He knew these people. He knew who was solid and who wasn't. He knew it better than anyone in the entire institution, which is exactly why they sent him. And that's exactly why his report was so dangerous. If they had sent a stranger to Suriname and come back saying, yeah, Valk is guilty, you could question that person's knowledge of the terrain and his grasp of the relationship and say that it lacked nuance, right? You could discredit his reading of the grasp of the relationships of who was telling the truth. You could dismiss it as being incomplete. But Koenders was not a stranger. He was the most knowledgeable man in the entire institution on this specific question. His competence was the problem. You couldn't discredit the finding without discrediting the man who made it, and you couldn't discredit the man without discrediting the apparatus that had produced him. So, instead, they buried the report and they kept him in place. And that's the whole tragedy of Koenders. Not that he failed at his job, but that he was too dang good at it. But the story doesn't end with the report getting buried, because Major Koenders did not leave B1. He stayed. And the map that he had spent 1980 and 1981 building, the map of who was still loyal and accessible and who could still be reached inside of the exile resistance, that map didn't go into the same filing cabinet as the Valk report. It went somewhere else entirely. So, question is, who ran the institution that could bury a senior officer's criminal conduct with 2 words and a coordinating officer's official nod? That question has a specific answer, and it starts with a dispute between 2 intelligence services that had been fighting over jurisdiction since the 1950s. So the Dutch military had its own intelligence service, LAMID. And the Dutch government had a civilian domestic security service, the BVD, with kind of like their equivalent of the FBI, who was responsible for internal security. In most countries, 2 organizations with overlapping mandates spend as much time fighting each other as fighting actual threats. They're turf wars and jurisdictional arguments. Whose case is this? Who runs this investigation? Who owns this file? You've probably seen this happen in movies, right? Where you'll have like your local sheriffs on the scene and they're like, I got this. And all of a sudden then somebody comes in from the FBI and then the sheriff hangs their head and like FBI takes over. Unless someone above them comes in, there's always a bigger fish, right? So the Dutch had fought that kind of fight for a decade, and it got ugly. And LAMID accused the BVD of promising things and then doing the opposite. And the BVD accused LAMID of overstepping into the civilian territory. And they were both kind of right. So on March 21st, 1960, they reached this formal agreement. It was like a cooperation protocol designed to stop the fighting and divide up the work. And as a part of the agreement, there was a new office that was created at Section B of LAMID. It was this liaison bureau called the B1. Its specific job or function was to serve as a formal bridge between LAMID and the BVD for all the counterintelligence matters. So the Dutch word for it was Schulte, the link, the connection point, the hinge between the two services that each had the authority that the other needed. So the agreement that they made had a specific rule built into it. LAMID would refrain from gathering data using secret means and methods, because that was the BVD's domain. LAMID handled all the military side, and the BVD handled the civilian side. And B1 sat at the seam between them, managing all the handoffs. So on paper, it's an administrative liaison, a glorified handoff desk. In practice, it's one of the most powerful positions in Dutch intelligence because the person who is sitting at the bridge between the two services sees everything that crosses it, both directions. Every operation that requires Dutch institutional resources had to cross that desk. So anything from security clearances to facility access to vetting out protocols to NATO stay-behind networks and personnel deployment and authorizations, nothing moved without the B1's approval. And they put Harm Roloff Reinders in charge of it. Now, you're going to meet Harm properly in the chapter on the Shadow Command later as a person, fully fleshed out person, rather than just his function in the B1, which we're talking about now. That story will start in April of 1944 in a small little Dutch village called Bedum, where the Nazis came for the men. And understanding what he built requires to understand what built him, but we'll get there. For now, just think about Reinders as the airport security checkpoint. Instead of checking your bags for liquids, he was checking whether you were the liquid, right? If you wanted security clearance for a classified operation, B1 approves it or denies it. If you need access for NATO's stay-behind networks or secret armies we're describing, B1 makes sure you pass and get vetted out first. And if you get a little too cozy with some leftist-leaning NCOs down in Suriname, you might have to report to Reinders' desk and he might want to have a conversation with you. So the position determined who could operate, what they could access, when somebody needed to be stopped. It wasn't really glamorous. It was paperwork and personnel files, but that's exactly what made it very powerful. And Reinders was not just processing paperwork. By late 1969, LAMID launched a project that was called Fatima, and it was run in cooperation with the BVD, personally led by the defense side by Bureau B1, by Reinders. So Fatima was a systemic infiltration operation where they were targeting the Dutch Conscripts Union, the VVDM, the peace movement organizations, and the action groups the military deemed a threat to defense readiness. So the project was especially activated after 1979 when the VVDM took a public stance against nuclear weapons. Recruiters approached senior VVDM members. They conscripted soldiers were recruited as undercover informants inside civilian peace organizations. You had high school students who were being approached by their teachers and being asked to identify classmates who might be suitable for future recruitments as infiltrants. So they had this whole automated computer screening system called the CompuSpotting, which went through entire induction classes before recruits even reported for duty. They were flagging certain candidates before their military service began. So some of what Fatima did had no legal basis whatsoever. The letters from the VVDM board were secretly being opened. They had this spray method that was developed to make the envelope's contents visible without breaking the seal on it. The apparatus designed to protect Dutch military institutions from subversions was themselves running covert operations against Dutch citizens on Dutch soil in a direct violation to the 1960 agreement that had explicitly prohibited LAMID from using secret means and methods. So the same institution, the same desk, the same man, and then Fatima expanded. And this is the part that changes how you understand everything else that follows. So Bob de Graaf's primary source documentation is pretty explicit. Project Fatima grew so the Moluccan and Surinamese communities in the Netherlands fell within the scope. Okay, read that again. The same illegal surveillance operation targeting Dutch peace activists was formally expanded to cover Surinamers living in the Netherlands. The same mail opening, the same infiltration methodology, the same B1 oversight, the whole Surinamese exile community, the same community that would produce the Misra Jomen operation in the summer of 82, the same community that Van Haperen would penetrate in 82-83, was already inside Fatima's operational net before any of that happened. So Van Haperen wasn't improvised. He was Fatima with different instructions. And the minister who authorized this, Hans van Mierlo. So de Graaf documents that Van Mierlo, during his tenure as the defense minister from 81 to 82, was personally aware of Fatima's operations and involved in the decisions made under it. So the same Van Mierlo who authorized the training of Bouterse's intelligence service, the same Van Mierlo who allowed Koenders' report to be buried, the same Van Mierlo who deployed Adjutant Verdier to Paramaribo on a mission that his wife wasn't even aware of. One minister, all of it running simultaneously. So the whole apparatus was only as strong as the whole institution around it. And by 1981, that institution was starting to have some serious problems. And the problem was that the IDB, which was the Foreign Intelligence Service, the very place where the Shadow Command were housed, they had become what Prime Minister Lubbers called a leaky basket. So the biggest glaring problem that they had was this Major Isbrand Smit, who was the head of processing at the IDB. So that was the man who oversaw the analysis of every piece of intercepted electronic intelligence that was flowing into the Netherlands. So he was kind of a gatekeeper, if you will, except this Smith guy had been compromised years earlier while he was serving over in the Middle East by a classic honeypot operation. You may remember we talked about that in episode 1 with Roy Horb and how he got snared into a honeypot. So the recruiter was a Dutch-speaking Israeli veterinary surgeon named Uzi Gnok, who had studied in Utrecht and knew how to make a Dutch officer feel like he was among friends. Now, Uzi had approached every Dutch officer, UN officer stationed in Tiberias, but it was Smit who said yes. He had allowed himself to be recruited by the Israeli Mossad, and he eventually would marry a woman who was a Mossad agent specifically sent to him to ensure his loyalty to a foreign power rather than the Dutch crown. In 1983, Smit was exposed and he was brought before a council of war behind closed doors, but he walked free. The court accepted his defense that the whole Dutch-Israeli intelligence cooperation was so strong that information would have been shared between the two services anyway. So a man caught spying for foreign powers was acquitted on the grounds that the foreign power was friendly enough that it didn't really count. So remember that concept, the honeypot, using a personal relationship to turn an institutional insider. It will become very important when we start to talk about Roy Horb, who we talked about earlier. But the irony of the whole thing is just too much almost to absorb. You have Reinders, who is personally running Project Fatima, which was illegally opening activist mail and recruiting high school students as infiltrants and surveilling the Surinamese diaspora, all to protect the integrity of the Dutch institutions from ideological contamination. Meanwhile, the head of Dutch Gladio was running a foreign intelligence service where his top analyst was keeping a Kalashnikov in his basement, a gift from a foreign service. So the pool filter wasn't just letting dirt in. The whole filter itself was contaminated. So here's the thing that really ties this all together. The thing that the existing record shows without any ambiguity. On January 27, 1982, 3 months before the Rambocus coup, Reinders chaired a security section meeting of the 450th Counterintelligence Detachment. Item 9 in the meeting says this: B1 Reinders will analyze the data from the detachment to prevent future surprises of the von Rysvik phenomenon. So Oscar von Rysvik was a peace activist under the Project Fatima surveillance who had somehow obtained detailed NATO facility plans, runway dimensions, underground fuel storage, tactical operations, center locations. Surveillance that was supposed to prevent exactly this had failed. A vetting failure, exactly the kind of thing that B1 existed to prevent. So, same meeting, same minutes, same page. Major Koenders will be seconded to Suriname for approximately 2 months to set up an intelligence organization, presumably March-April. 2 items, 1 meeting, 1 man, domestic surveillance failure being analyzed, and foreign deployment being authorized in the same breath at the same desk. That's January 27th. The Rambocus coup was March 11th. The planned deployment window and the coup window were the same. On February 27, 1982, Reinders published his aviation column, his side gig, in the Nieuwsblad van het Noorden. His byline would not appear again for 22 months. And then there's something else B1 managed that almost nobody knew about for decades later. The vetting process for NATO's entire stay-behind network, Gladio. So who decided which personnel got cleared for operations, who maintained security protocols, who coordinated with Belgian and German stay-behind networks across the border? B1, the same liaison office that was the bridge between LAMID and BVD, the same office that personally led Project Fatima, the same office that had been expanded domestic surveillance to cover the Surinamese community in the Netherlands, the same office that had just deployed Koenders to Suriname and buried the report that he had come back with. When Koenders was sent to investigate the network that Peter Meyer had documented, the one that had discovered Black Tulip, allegedly, that was B1 deploying a damage control specialist to map the exposure. When the September 81 report confirming Valk's guilt got buried with the Bergmar Op file it away decision that flowed through an institutional structure that was designed to protect operational security over accountability. So when Meyer received his crazy reception at the Schiphol airport with doctors and ambulances all waiting for him on the tarmac, that level of coordination required institutional authority, B1 authority, Reinders level authority. So Reinder, as the hinge between the military and the civilian intelligence, he was the gatekeeper for NATO's secret armies. He was personally running a legal surveillance operation that had formerly expanded to cover the Surinamese community. And he was the institutional authority that had deployed Koenders to Suriname, buried the Valk report, and cleared the path for everything else that followed. He sat right at the center of it. Not glamorously, not visibly, at a bureaucratic desk in The Hague, in a building most people probably couldn't find on a map, surrounded by personnel files and security protocols. And by the time that Peter Meyer arrived in Suriname in April of 1981, before all the craziness, every piece of that machinery was already in motion and had been for over a year. So before we go any further and dive into whether the sergeant's coup was an inside job, let's be really clear about what we're not claiming. I am not saying that the Black Tulip document was the blueprint for the February 1980 sergeant's coup. And that might disappoint some people here, but that's not how most Gladio operations worked. And Gladio operations are what we are investigating here around the sergeant's coup. So the parliamentary investigations into stay-behind networks did uncover some documented coup plans. So Italy's piano solo from 1964, there was a detailed blueprint for occupying government offices and imprisoning of political opponents at the Gladio headquarters in Sardinia. The Tora Tora plan in 1970 with very specific instructions for seizing the Interior Ministry, broadcasting centers. Then you had Belgium's Puma directives, which the expertly written commando manuals that were found in the possession of the Westland New Post operatives, Greece's Prometheus Plan, a NATO contingency document that was repurposed for a 1967 coup. So these are not myths, they are real plans. They were sitting in real filing cabinets discovered by real investigations. But those documented blueprints were kind of the exception rather than the rule. The majority of Gladio operations, the one that left the lightest footprints, the one that were the hardest to prosecute and prove, the ones with the most deniability, they relied on something a little bit more sophisticated than written down plans. They relied on handler relationships. You had individual operatives that were embedded within an existing military or an advisory structure, and they were working with specific targets over months and years, building the relationships and providing tactical frameworks and creating the right environment where designed outcomes to emerge looking like they were organic from local conditions, not looking like they were foreignly orchestrated, right? So that's how a lot of these networks operated in Italy and Belgium and Greece. They weren't handwritten plans in the margins like Peter Meyer described. We're looking for those handler relationships. One operative cultivating one or two key targets, encouraging them, coaching them, making sure that the right people understood the right opportunity at the right moments, all while maintaining plausible deniability for the machine, the Gladio machine, through the very structure of how that relationship worked. So the handler's job wasn't to order the coup. It was to make sure that the local actors, if they decided to execute on one, that they felt confident that they understood what they were doing, that the infrastructure existed and supported them, that their actions served larger strategic interests, that they wouldn't be alone. And that is exactly what multiple independent witnesses describe Hans Valk doing in Suriname. So what we're looking for is a Gladio fingerprint. Does it appear that Colonel Hans Valk and others acted like Gladio-styled handlers? And multiple independent witnesses, people who didn't have any reason to be coordinating their stories, who spoke years apart with different political loyalties, they all confirmed the same thing, which was Hans Valk encouraged, goaded, and provided coaching to the Surinamese before and after the February 1980 coup. But perhaps the most important question is, did the Gladio operations ever stop? After the sergeant's coup, there were 8 unique military challenges to the Bouterse regime, 11 if you want to count the alleged Ormskirk coup in April-May 1980. You also had the leftist allegations against Sital Joman Jaws in August of 1980. Rambocus was also imprisoned. You have the first Hawker coup, alleged Hawker coup, or assassination attempt in March of 1981. Then all of them failed, and then 8 had indications of elements of sabotage that were in them. And the question is, why? And more importantly, who was it who was keeping Bouterse in power? And there's something else that we really need to understand about this whole story, because it wasn't just about proving Gladio methodology was used in Suriname. It's about what happens when a Gladio asset goes rogue and figures out how to fight back. Now, let's get back to our story. Okay, here we go. February 22nd, 1980. We're 3 days before the coup. And Colonel Hans Valk had visited the protesting soldiers who were down at Bomika. Now, that was the Union building that they had renamed after their organization, which was the Union of Military NCOs. So the soldiers were all dug in. They were protesting their right to unionize. They wanted fair pay. They wanted health care. And 3 of their union leaders were sitting in prison. And the standoff with Commander Elstock, who had taken over power or in charge after Surinamese independence, that was ratcheting up. And Colonel Hans Valk, who was the head of the Dutch's military mission, he showed up to give some advice. And there was a journalist there, and the conversation got recorded on tape. And Valk says, "Guys, if you go back now, you're screwed." Now, that's not inference or any kind of rumor. That's Colonel Valk's voice on tape coaching the soldiers about how to overthrow the government, or whether it leads to overthrow the government. And he didn't stop there. He said, If the government extends you a hand, you must accept it immediately, but don't capitulate. You mustn't take a step back. Think about what that means. A Dutch military officer with diplomatic status representing The Hague telling the coup plotters, don't back down, hold your position, toe the line, push forward. So when the conversation turned about the imprisoned soldiers, the Abram Sitol's need, that's when Valk's coaching got a lot more explicit. He said, if they're in there, then the others are at fault. Must you keep saying forever what the commander does is right? Then you end up with SS-like situations. An order is an order. And what we learned in Nuremberg, that is not right. So he's calling in the Nuremberg defense. So Valk is ultimately telling them that they had the moral right and authority to disobey orders, that following Commander Elstak, the old guard commander who Balthazar called a clown, would make them like part of SS situations. The post-World War II trial of the Nazi officers, the court had established a principle that you are responsible for refusing illegal, immoral orders. That's not passive support by Valk. That's not just influencing them or a breakdown of professional distance, which is what the Prompt Committee would later say that he was accused of. It was active coaching preserved on tape recording 3 days prior to the February 25th coup. So that tape captured a lot more too, because Valk railed against the army leadership who, quote, have absolutely no understanding how things work here in the army. He argued that the imprisoned sergeants didn't belong there, and then his guidance got a little more tactical. He said, I did think the Netherlands has to say something, but they don't want mediation here. I told the guys if the government extends a hand, you must accept it immediately, but don't capitulate. You mustn't step back. On tape, 3 days before the coup. Now, 4 days before the coup, on February 21st, 1980, at 2 p.m., Valk receives a phone call from an NCO warning that Sorkenhoop ammunition depot was going to be raided. So what was Valk's response? He says that he refused to engage any further. He claimed he didn't want to be accused of calling wolf, since Ambassador Wegelin had complained about his previous warnings about the problems in Suriname. Better to wait and see if it actually happens. After all, there's so many things that happen in Suriname that turns out not to be bad afterwards. Interesting. So here's one way that you can look at it. It probably had a little bit to do, or a lot to do, with Valk's strained relationship with Ambassador Wegelin. So Wegelin had spent years calling Valk an alarmist, watering down his reports that were being sent back to The Hague. So when Valk got this new warning about the raid on the ammunition depot, maybe he genuinely thought, here we go again, another false alarm. I'm not risking my credibility this time. That's one way to look at it. Wegelin had already been scheduled to leave Paramaribo, and he departed as planned. So the Dutch ministry would later cite his departure as evidence of how poorly informed he was about what was brewing. Minister Van der Claw would claim that the coup came as a complete surprise. But the contemporary record from back in the day was pretty unambiguous. The Telegraph reported on February 27th that Wegelin was stranded in New York en route to The Hague for a conference. Trouw confirmed that on March 1st that he had been in the Netherlands attending a conference of the ambassadors from developing countries. So those are two newspapers days apart. Neither of them are mentioning Curaçao. So Curaçao gets entered into the record 3.5 years later in De Volkskrant's analysis of where Wegelin was from a piece in August of 1983. So the journalist who wrote the article immediately questioned it himself, asking whether the conspirators had been waiting for the ambassador to be absent and whether that was exactly why he had left the country. So no other source out there corroborates the Curaçao account that that's where he was. But years later, the ambassador's story would change yet again. So by 2009, when the Dutch public television program under a Tiden, finally put Voegelin on camera. The whole Curacao conference had quietly disappeared from his account. 29 years after the fact, the former ambassador described his reason for being gone from Paramaribo with 6 words. I had things to do abroad. He didn't say a conference. He didn't say he was in Curacao, not The Hague. Didn't say he was in New York. Just I had things to do. More troubling is what the lead investigator, Major Koenders, said on that same program. The intelligence officer who had investigated the coup, the same man whose report Demick would later bury, placed Voegelin's route going through French Guiana the day before the coup. Now, that's the same corridor that Johan Casatoruno, the former Minister of Agriculture, that he used to escape the country on the coup day itself. So French Guiana is, you got to understand, is not a natural way to get to Curacao. It's not on the way to going to The Hague. It's east of Paramaribo. It's the opposite direction from the Dutch Caribbean. And a Dutch ambassador traveling to a conference in Europe or the Netherlands Antilles had no real logistical reason to go on a route through Cayenne. You had KLM flights back then. You look at the newspapers, they had 5 direct flights per week going from Paramaribo to Amsterdam. So a Dutch ambassador traveling to a conference going east, the wrong direction, the only reason to route through Cayenne rather than to board the KLM flight directly is if you don't want to be on that KLM flight. If your departure needs to go through a different kind of door. But Voegelin wasn't the only one whose account had shifted. In his written rebuttal to the Free Nederland 1982 investigation, Colonel Valk placed the ambassador not in Curacao, not in French Guiana, where Major Koenders would place him on camera in 2009, but he put him in New York. So you have 3 different accounts, 3 different destinations, the same man, the same departure, the same day before the coup. Surinamese ex-military source who was interviewed in 1996, he added a 4th account to this. He had personally told the ambassador days before the coup that the situation was becoming turbulent. Voegelin left anyways. The man brought his testimony to the Prompt Commission and, quote, my statement was, of course, not included in the report. No parliamentary commission ever asked Voegelin to produce his travel documentation. The Prompt Commission accepted his absence as evidence of his ignorance, and then they moved on. Now, Koenders did not move on. He was an investigator. He says, if Voegelin knows, then the Netherlands formally knows. So the question never really got answered because it never really was formally asked. And there's one more account that belongs in this room, which is on February 23rd, 1980, 2 days before the coup, a law lecturer named Harvey Narendorp attended the Fort Zeelandia reception as a stand-in for the faculty dean. Now, he had never seen or spoken with Colonel Valk before, and Valk grabbed him by his elbow and said quietly, Narendorp, it's going to happen in a few days. With this government, it is no longer bearable. All plans are ready. Then he walked away. Now, Narendorp didn't understand what he had been told until the coup happened 2 days later on February 25th. He later stated, and I quote, based on my experience, it can be stated with certainty that he knew in advance. He told me so in so many words at a reception 2 days before the coup. He had no institutional reason to say this. He had no axe to grind. He was nobody that Valk needed to impress. And this is where, if we put on our Gladio glasses for just a second, the whole pattern of what's going on here starts to look very different. Voegelin's leaving wasn't negligence, it was tactical isolation. Think about the whole timing. Valk receives a warning about an ammunition theft and a hostage situation, which is a clear indicator of coup preparation. An ambassador who knows about that can't leave the country. He'd have to stay and investigate, possibly alert The Hague, maybe even stop the operation if he could. But if the ambassador doesn't know, he can leave. And when he's gone, there's plausible deniability for everybody. We had no idea. Look, even our ambassador was out of the country. Sources confirmed that Valk withheld intelligence from Voegelin. When later questioned about this, Valk claimed he was only informed of the theft when His Excellency was already gone. Pretty convenient timing. But the cover story was always legitimate. That was the point. An ambassador attends a conference. Labor leaders attend union consultations. A sports team crosses a border. The cover story didn't have to be perfect. It needed to be plausible enough that no one would question it in advance, and defensible enough afterward that no one would attempt to disprove it. So 2 years later, Cyril Dahl, Andre Hochman would use the exact same excuse before the Rambocus coup erupted. They left for union talks in Barbados the day that Cyril Dahl gave an inflammatory public speech, one day before the whole leaked document crisis we talked about in the Temple plot, 2 days before the Temple plot itself, 6 days before Rambocus moved on the barracks. So it was a legitimate cover story, convenient timing, the whole civilian track moving to safety while the military track got prepared to strike. So this story repeats over and over again for the next years. French Guiana is to the east, Curacao to the north. Between them, Suriname's kind of bracketed for escape, for infiltration, for staging and processing. Deportees from the Botza coup later in 1984, they got rerouted to Curacao back to Amsterdam. The advance team for Van Happeren's alleged coup plans were traveling from French Guiana disguised as a sports team, and the main invasion force for Van Happeren's mission was supposed to fly from Curacao on a U.S. Army C-130. So then there's the other story that says that he wasn't stranded in Curacao or French Guiana, but numerous newspapers say that he was stranded in New York City in February 1980. And if that's true, that's even more weird because that puts him stranded in a 10-block radius containing his own secure communications at the Dutch permanent mission to the United Nations. You also had the U.S. regional policy experts who were at the American mission to the UN. You have the operational machinery for any countermove at the CIA's New York station. So that's another very convenient place for him to be. So whatever door closed, the door kept him precisely where you would want a Dutch ambassador in a country mid-coup. So whether or not Voegelin knew what was coming, he was traveling through the same kind of infrastructure, using the same kind of cover at the exact same kind of moment. So that is either one of the most remarkable series of coincidences in modern Dutch diplomatic history, or it isn't a coincidence at all. He had decades that he could have answered this question. All he had to do was to show a hotel receipt, a conference agenda with his name on it, a passport stamp, a colleague who remembered him seeing him at the table, any single piece of evidence of paper from any of the places that he claimed to have been going. And as far as I know, he never produced one. And if anybody's a better researcher and they're back in the Netherlands and this is actually back in the archive somewhere where we can clear his name and find the conference that he was at and say, here's the list and here's proof that he was here and it was all there the whole time, that would clear up this matter really quickly. My question is, why didn't he just say that on television or in all the interviews for 40 years if it was that easy to clear up? Because when they put him back on TV in 2009, 30 years later, with the Prompt Commission long done, all he had to say about it was, I had things to do abroad. All right, Saturday, February 23rd, now we're 2 days before the coup. So now that Voegelin is safely leaving the country, Valk started to give warnings out, but only to people who weren't going to interfere. Valk learned from a member of his own military mission that a raid had actually taken place that morning in the early hours, and he was scheduled to attend a reception later that evening at Fort Zeelandia that would be attended by the entirety of Paramaribo, including President Ferrier. So, fearing that the plotters might actually use the stolen ammunition and the weapons to take hostages, Valk warned the charge d'affaires, Mr. Singh Damaste, about the coming crisis. So Damaste apparently rushed to Ferrier with the warning, and Valk later stated that he believed that his alert had helped prevent anarchy or a hostage situation that night. Now, the irony wouldn't really become clear for 2 years. The plotters Valk warned about in February 1980, Bouterza, Rambocus, Horb, they had planned to raid the armory and possibly take hostages at Fort Zeelandia. In March of 1982, Bouterza and Horb would find themselves as the targets of the hostage-taking at the same Fort Zeelandia. So the man who was holding them would be their former co-conspirator, Surrender Rambocus, who was now working with Wilfred Hawker against the regime that they had all built together. So look at the pattern here. February 21st, he withhold ammunition intel from Voegelin, which ensures that Voegelin departs. February 23rd, warned the deputy about the reception threat, which prevents chaos and Dutch casualties, but doesn't stop the coup. And then February 25th, the coup ends up happening. Voegelin's absence becomes proof of the surprise. So if you're running a Gladio operation, this is how you would do it. You would remove the highest ranking official who might block you. You would keep things through a deputy you can manage but who won't derail your entire operation. And you would give just enough warning to prevent total chaos, but not enough time to actually stop what's coming. So what interpretation better fits the evidence that we're looking at? The strained relationship theory requires us to believe that Valk was just so worried about being called an alarmist that he, 1, ignored a specific warning about an ammunition theft, 2, didn't tell his ambassador about a potential hostage situation, 3, waited until the ambassador was gone, 4, then he warned someone else about a different threat. Then, after the coup, he claimed he only learned about the theft when it was too late. And he told Harvey Narendorp that it was all going to happen in 2 days. Or we could just believe that Valk deliberately made sure that Voegelin was gone so that everybody could claim that we didn't know things while Valk kept running things in the background. So the question isn't whether Voegelin knew. The question is, did Valk deliberately make sure that he wouldn't? So this kind of tactical isolation where you remove a senior official before the sensitive operations, that has a way of becoming a playbook. Once you know it works, why not use it again and again, which they would in December of 1981. But let's get to the next day, which is Sunday, February 24th, one day before the coup. So the next evening, Valk attends a celebration for a course that his daughter had completed. There he spoke with the Dutch journalist Hermine Camphius, telling her that the hostage situation was possibly at hand. Hours later, in the early morning of Monday, 25th of February, around 2 to 3 a.m., the coup itself began. February 25th, 1980, this is the night of the coup. This is Valk's version of the story. Valk maintained that he was not at the barracks, despite allegations that he was seen at the encampment by several Surinamese journalists who said that they saw him walking around on the night of the coup. He said, quote, "I was in bed. My wife can swear to that when I received the call from one of his NCOs telling me that shots had been fired near the barrack. His wife picked up the phone at 6 a.m. He said that's when he learned about the coup. Simple story, clean alibi, but let's look at some of the evidence here. The Prompt Commission received conflicting testimony. Valk had been called as early as 2:30 a.m. when the coup actually started. Elsewhere, Valk admitted to maybe around 4 a.m. to reporters, or maybe it was 5:30 a.m. at the latest. Valk claimed that mission member Sergeant Major Koenders called him around 6 a.m. to report the shooting. When the committee tried to contact Mr. Koenders, who was living in Suriname, to clear up the timing issue, he refused to provide a statement. Remember that official story. We're going to come back to that. I was asleep. A call woke me up at 6 a.m. You're going to hear that tale again, and next time it's not going to be Valk that's telling that story. So let's talk about the Clements Connection and revisit what other members of the mission were allegedly doing that night. Remember this quote. One evening, he, Laura, had drunk so much that he spoke openly about the coup, saying that it had been completed at Clements with Valk's knowledge and that they had left from Clements. You know who they are. Remember, that was Peter Meyer who said that in his letter to Colonel Marcevain on June 16, 1981. So it was supposed to be a private letter. Meyer was actually furious and he was terrified when he found out that his former boss had leaked his findings, written to a confidant at the intelligence service, that Marcevain was now treating the letter as hard evidence and warning that the exposure could be dangerous for me. Which he had a right to be scared, right? I mean, Marcevain had left the country under threat of his own life. Baudouin had said that he would kill him. So to leak that kind of information in the public put Meyer's life at risk. So the source of that quote was Lieutenant Nico Laura, who was a drunk member of the Dutch military mission bragging at the Hotel Krasnopolski, who claimed that the coup was launched from Captain Clements' own home. But, I mean, this is secondhand testimony, because Meyer overheard it from Laura, and then Meyer reported it to Marcevain, and that's how we come up with this content. Plus, he was drunk at the time. It's easy to write it off and dismiss it. Except Major Koenders' secret intelligence report that he submitted September 7th, 1981, also confirmed it. When Koenders went and interviewed Captain Clements, Clements admitted that the people, the coup plotters, came to his house an hour after the coup began. And he naturally advised them, Clements said, but he claimed he did that not as an NMMS member, but just doing it as a friend. Just some friendly coup advice. Documented by the B1's Suriname expert, Koenders, a man with a decade of intelligence work. So Koenders' report was even more specific. Just 1 hour after the coup succeeded, the coup plotters celebrated with a party at Clements' home. So not just advice, a victory party. Now let's get to the identical alibis. When the Prompt Commission investigated, they found no one willing to confirm Laura's statement. Laura had sobered up by then. Both Clement and his wife fiercely denied the allegation that the coup was launched from their home or that they had supported at their home, and everything else that they had told Koenders they retracted. The committee accepted this denial based upon the testimony from his loyal friend Captain Briere, who said, on the day of the coup, all mission members gathered at the Dutch embassy and followed the events from there. But MP Wijsglas of the Prompt Committee, he noted something that was odd about the parliamentary debate. There was a critical gap because Briere only confirmed where Clement was the next morning. Nobody really verified where Clement was from the hours of 2 a.m. when the coup began and 6 a.m. when somebody, identified as the neighbor, called with the news, which was the exact same gap as Valk's alibi. So let's take a look at the timeline here. 2 a.m. is when you have the naval base attack at Beekbergen, and that begins. Then you have at 4 a.m. is when the first shots are fired. Valk is allegedly seen by reporters near the barracks at this time. He denies it. 3 a.m., Captain Clements is giving friendly coup advice to the plotters, per the Koenders report. 3:45 to 4 a.m., there's a victory party at Clements' house, per Laura and Meyer's written letter to Marcevain. 2:45 to 5 a.m., Valk admits receiving a series of calls, or at least one call that he can't quite place. And then at 6 a.m., both Valk and Clements officially claimed that they woke up and were told about the coup. So both of them slept like babies during a coup until a neighbor gave them a 6 a.m. wake-up call. It's almost as if they might have coordinated those stories down to the minute. So here's where we got to go back to Black Tulip, because if Peter Meyer was right, if he had actually found what he said he found, which was a copy of Black Tulip annotated with precise patterns and response times and radio frequencies, in that case, Valk and Clements' cover stories weren't just covering the same hours by accident, they were monitoring the same exact operational phases. And the Prompt Commission years later never fully explained either Valk or Clements could have been home sleeping, and in Clements' case, at his residence advising the coup plotters an hour after their nighttime operation, because they never fully corroborated these activities during these really crucial morning hours. And then there's the driving lesson. So one of Valk's key defenses relied on a very curious claim that he let his 18-year-old daughter go to a driving lesson at 7:30 a.m. that morning. Here's his quote. "If I had been involved in a coup," he argued, "I would never have let my daughter go out in the streets that morning." Sounds pretty reasonable, right? A protective father would not let his daughter go out driving during a coup. But let's walk through that logic a little bit. Valk admitted receiving a call at 4 a.m. about shots fired near the barracks. 3 hours later, at 7:30 a.m., he sends his teenage daughter out for a driving lesson. So this is how I see this. There's four possibilities. Either A, he didn't take the shooting seriously, which sounds implausible for a military commander who had been warned about a possible hostage situation just days before. Or maybe he thought it was all over by 7:30, but then how would he know that unless he had a detailed knowledge of the operational timeline? Or maybe he knew exactly where we're safe and where wasn't, which requires, again, knowing about the operational plans. Or he's lying about the timing, which means that his alibi falls apart. Or he sent his daughter to safety and then he just called it driving lessons. So pick one. They all prove guilt. The only way that you confidentially send your daughter out driving during a coup is if you know what the operational plan is. You know what's happening where. You know where it's safe and where it's not. So Valk's proof of innocence actually proved that he had detailed foreknowledge of what was unfolding. When confronted about the whole discrepancy between what he had told Koenders and what he had told the committee, Clements indignantly denied ever making the statement about his role. Koenders stood by his report. During the Parliamentary debate on March 21st, 1984, MPs asked the questions that the committee had avoided. What did Colonel Valk do in the meantime? And regarding Clements, clearly it is not clear what he did during that night. The committee never explained how Clements could have both been at home sleeping and planning and possibly victory party during those crucial hours. They simply chose not to investigate it. So when Colonel Marcefain later threatened to expose the mission's involvement, Briere and Clements appealed to Major Koenders, the same intelligence officers who had documented Clements' admissions. Koenders advised them to stay quiet, to keep the lid on the cesspool, otherwise a whole can of worms would have been thrown open. So the questions hung in the air. No answers came. So when Joris Demick assessed the Koenders report as containing just rumors and no new facts and recommended it not proceed up the chain, he wasn't protecting a policy, he was protecting Hans Valk, the son of General C.J. Valk, who had served as the military adjutant to Queen Beatrix. The ambassador in Paramaribo openly admitted that he had protected the elder Valk's son because of his connections. Those connections ran straight to the throne. And Joris Demick, the civilian gatekeeper who had decided what the minister would see, belonged to the same Minerva alumni network as Beatrix herself. The same private database, the same phone book of names that 2/3 of Netherlands' most powerful figures shared. So whether any of that was explicit is unknowable. Whether Demick picked up a phone and said, hey, this must disappear because of who his father is, there's no documents that would say that. What there is a document of is the result. The report disappeared. The son of the Queen's adjutant was never held responsible. And the man that made that move possible moved steadily up the ladder in the Dutch state until Demick became one of the highest ranking civil servants. And as we'll see, managing PR for the Dutch state was part of Koenders' job description as the former head of S2 Intelligence and Security in Suriname. So there had been this geopolitical shift in Dutch foreign policy towards Suriname, and Koenders' role was going to play a very, very important role. So if you look at what the Prompt Committee chose not to find, you got to look at what they had. They had written intelligence reports where Koenders had documented Clements' admissions. They had documented confessions, Laura's statement to Myers. They had a timeline analysis, identical 4-hour gaps that Valk and Clements both claimed to be in the same place. They had multiple witnesses contradicting the official stories. And then they had the physical impossibilities because their alibis didn't match the timelines. And they chose to believe the denials. So this wasn't an investigation, at least not a proper one. It seems to have been a cover-up. And the investigation was over before it began. The idea that two of the most senior members of the Dutch military mission who had advanced knowledge of the coup plotting allegedly slept peacefully through explosions that shook Paramaribo, that woke 65 American crewmen and American embassy personnel until they got a convenient 6 a.m. wake-up call from their neighbors, as laughable. February 25th, 1980, 16 sergeants overthrew the government of Suriname in less than 12 hours. By dawn, they moved. By sunrise, they controlled the barracks. By mid-morning, they held the radio station, and by lunch, Prime Minister Henk Aaron's government ceased to exist. 5 people died, no foreign troops intervened. Desi Boutuza, a sergeant major and PE teacher just the day before, now ran the country. Valk's advice had worked. What shocked everyone was just how smooth everything went. These weren't just some sergeants who were hopped up on marijuana who stumbled half-assed through a revolt like U.S. Embassy personnel later suggested. Every move was calculated, every target secured, every potential resistance point neutralized before anybody could organize a defense. Someone had planned this, put some thought into it. It wasn't just a matter of plans on paper. The physical path against the resistance had been cleared for them. So when the sergeants moved, they didn't have to break into the armory. They found the doors unlocked and ammunition clips already loaded into the machine guns. Even the Dutch-made YP-408 armored tanks, the Panzers, which had been officially deemed beyond repair for 3 years, had been miraculously fixed by the Dutch captains Briere and Clements just in time to crash through the gates. So these sergeants didn't rob the bank, they just walked into a vault where someone had already disabled the alarms and left the doors wide open. But let's be specific about what the physical path had been cleared actually means. So standard military protocol requires that armories be secured with multiple locks and guard rotations and accountability systems for both the weapons and the ammunition. Yet on the night of February 24th and 25th, what the sergeants found was, 1, the doors were unlocked. They weren't picked, weren't forced open, they were unlocked. Ammunition was already loaded into clips in the machine guns. No guards were present at critical access points. The weapons accountability systems were non-functional. This was not the sergeants doing. They were sports instructors and drill sergeants. They didn't have the keys to the armory. They didn't have the authority to dismiss the guards. They didn't have the access to load up the ammunition into Dutch weapons. Someone with authority had prepared the pathway. Then you got to consider the tanks, the Dutch-made vehicles, the YP-408 armored vehicles that tell even a clearer story. These were Dutch-manufactured armored personnel carriers. They were sophisticated pieces of military hardware that required special maintenance and training. For years, these vehicles had been officially classified as beyond repair, broken, inoperable, listed on maintenance logs as non-functional. Then, in the weeks before the coup, something all changed. Dutch captains Briere and Clements of Valk's military mission suddenly repaired them. The vehicles that were broken for years were now operational and ready for deployment. On the night of the 24th and 25th of February, those same vehicles crashed through the gates of the Rambocus barracks and later intimidated the police and the government forces in the city center. So professional military operations executed with Dutch equipment made operational by Dutch officers just in time for the coup that their commander had been coaching. But just getting access to weapons and vehicles doesn't mean anything without the training to be able to use them effectively. Outside of Bouterse, who specifically possessed armored vehicle background from his time in the Dutch army, having served in the 47th Armored Infantry before returning to Suriname in Steenwijk, the other sergeants weren't armored vehicle specialists per se. They weren't trained in coordinating the assault tactics using mechanized infantry, except for that they had been, because the Dutch military mission under Colonel Valk's supervision had provided that. So this wasn't passive support, this was active facilitation at every single level. When Bouterse later told Valk, "Without you, Colonel, this coup would not have taken place," he wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. Which brings us back to the whole Black Tulip question. When investigators later examined the Black Tulip evacuation plan, every military expert who saw it said the same thing. This was not a coup blueprint. Ellen de Vries shared a copy of the Black Tulip document that she found in 2019 in the archives of both the National Archives and the Netherlands Institute of Military History in The Hague with a few men who had been there at that time. Hugo Fernandez Mendez, who was a former SKM officer, he reviewed the plan and was pretty blunt about it. This is extremely unsuitable as a coup plan. The goal of an evacuation plan is not to stay, but to scram as quickly as possible. Jeff Vert, who had been part of the Sandere group with their own coup planning, he agreed. This is clearly an evacuation plan in case of calamities, not a blueprint for seizing power. Vert and another officer, Dihal, had claimed that Bouterse had actually used their plan to execute the coup. And they were right, at least about the document that they saw. But remember Ted Westerlaar's word, the man who had drafted the original Black Tulip plan. He said, "I had no idea that the HRMS Rotterdam was a part of his plan." So certain people were not seeing revised plans. They were on a need-to-know basis when it came to revisions. So what Ellen de Vries had presented them, as far as I can tell from reading her book, was the archival copy of the original 1975 evacuation plan. What Peter Meyer claimed to have found was an annotated version with handwritten notes, adapted to it, and Meyer died before he could show anyone whatever evidence he claimed to have. But the debate misses the point, which is the sergeants didn't need a perfect coup plan. What they needed was someone to unlock the armories with ammunition already loaded. They needed broken vehicles suddenly operational. They needed years of tactical training and someone who could explain how to reverse engineer an evacuation into a takeover. Timing and guidance. So Black Tulip alone was not a coup plan. The experts were right. But Black Tulip combined with physical preparedness and training and coaching and vehicles and unlocked weapons, well, that's how you overthrow a government in 12 hours. Here's the part that the public never knew, and it's important because Gladio operations had always been an American coordination, specifically through the CIA, the Pentagon, and NATO command structures. And this last one, NATO, is really particularly interesting when you consider Bouterse's background, his NATO training, and he being one of the only NCOs stationed at a named NATO base. While Dutch Colonel Hans Valk was providing tactical coaching to the sergeants, his next-door neighbor was watching with very professional interest. Paul Good was a political and public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy. Ostensibly, he was America's top intelligence asset in the country, and he lived right next door to Colonel Hans Valk. They literally shared a fence. And at some point during the planning, the exact timing is not exactly clear, they cut a hole in that fence, Not for borrowing sugar or sharing beers, but for sharing intelligence. Good wasn't just any embassy diplomat. He was a veteran of the coup in Chile. And when he was asked about this in an interview later, his experience with coups, Good said something that revealed a lot more than what he probably intended. He said, coups are fun. Fun. That's the word that he used to describe the violent overthrow of democratic governments. Good cultivated intelligence assets within the embassy to keep tabs on Boutressa. His primary local source was Ronald Ronnie Renz Sr., a man whose life kind of mirrored the complexities of the era. He was a renowned Surinamese journalist and a former director of Suriname Television Foundation, STVS. And Renz was uniquely positioned to understand the plotters because Good claimed that Ronnie had been a grade school classmate of Valk's protege, Desi Boutressa. So their shared history, it's had its ups and downs. Apparently, Ronnie and Desi were childhood drinking buddies who had rode bicycles together. But their relationship had soured over a personal conflict involving a woman. Working as a press officer for the American embassy while Boutressa was in power, Ronnie was constantly worried about his physical well-being. So despite this fear, he provided Good with invaluable, unfiltered insights that official diplomatic channels, blinded by their reliance on high-level political figures, often missed. By 1982, as the regime's repression of the press intensified, Ronnie Renz was forced to flee his homeland, settling in nearby Curacao, there's Curacao again, to continue his career in exile. So on the night of February 24th and 25th, 1980, while the sergeants moved in Paramaribo, intelligence flowed through the neighbor's fence hole. Updates and status reports and real-time coordination between the Dutch and the American officers who just happened to be neighbors during a coup, and they both happened to be monitoring with unusual intensity. Except for Valk, who was allegedly asleep. But this wasn't just a fence. In the coincidence of a lifetime, 3 high-tech American aircraft arrived in Suriname with a specific code name, CLIFFHANGER. Think about that name, CLIFFHANGER, the moment of maximum suspense where you don't know if someone will survive or fall. The Americans chose that code name for aircraft that just happened to have the bad luck of arriving in Suriname hours before a coup that just happened to succeed with unprecedented success and professional precision. These were not passenger planes. These were America's most sophisticated intelligence platforms capable of real-time communications relay. And during the coup, they transmitted status updates directly to the Dutch embassy through the State Department. Not after the fact, but during the actual coup. The machinery was watching the machinery, and intelligence was flowing in multiple directions simultaneously. Americans monitoring the Dutch operations, monitoring the Surinamese, sergeants executing a coup that matched a Dutch contingency blueprint with terrifying accuracy. Any trained military analyst looking at this pattern would recognize a signature, which is coordinated intelligence support during live operations, not passive observation, active facilitation. You've got the fence hole, the aircraft, the local assets, the code name, the real-time updates. So if you've got your Gladio glasses on, this doesn't look like 2 nations watching a coup unfold. It looks a lot more like nations ensuring that it succeeded. And there's one more minor detail, which is Valk was afraid of something. According to Ellen DeFrays, upon his return in June 1st of 1980, an interview with the security section of the army, represented by Harm Reinders, Valk gave his analysis of the situation in Suriname, where he said, "The Americans held the Netherlands responsible for Suriname and expected the Netherlands to keep Cuba out of their house." In the conversation, Valk expressed his concerns about the leftist danger threatening Suriname in the person of Harvey Narendorp of the People's Party. He would later blame Cubans, not him, for helping the coup. It gives you some motive and it gives you opportunity. So within hours of the coup ending, the Dutch intelligence machinery was already moving, and now we know exactly what that machinery looked like. So at the center of the whole thing was Colonel A.W. Bram Schulte. So Schulte's story starts way back in 1952 as a young artillery cadet in Breda, which is the very same academy that Surrender Rambocus had studied at some years later. So Schulte didn't stay in the barracks there. He moved throughout the halls of power. The archival records from Harm van Riel collection show that as early as 1968, while he was still a major, Schulte was already bypassing the usual chain of commands in the military to write these private defense reports for Harm van Riel, who was the most powerful man in the VVD political party. So Schulte was a political officer before that term really existed much in the Dutch military apparatus. He understood how to bridge the gap between the secret military operations and the politicians back in The Hague who provided the top cover. But Schulte wasn't just writing reports for the local politicians. He was also a key intellectual node in a much larger off-the-books infrastructure. So while he was rising through the ranks, Schulte was also a writer and a contributor to Le Spectator, the military spectator. You'll find his works in the archives right alongside the FSAN. As historian and scholar Giles Scott Smith has already documented, the FSAN was the Dutch branch of Interdoc, which is this transnational Cold War international, like funded by big corporate giants like Heineken and KLM, kind of a public think tank. So this connection is a bit of a smoking gun for the Schulte career, because it meant that while officially he was an artillery officer and later an intelligence chief, he was simultaneously within this privately funded network to link the Dutch security apparatus to very high-level American friends, corporate friends. So by the time the 1980 coup had happened, Schulte had already spent the better part of a decade perfecting the art of transnational solidarity, using these private foundations that execute these hardline anti-communist strategies that official government policy really couldn't touch. So it wouldn't be until 1985, when his name and address and phone number were part of a leak of the Unkraut activist break-in to the CID headquarters, that his connection to the more sensitive counterintelligence branch would become clear. So after the coup, Schulte assigned an investigation, not to a junior analyst or some desk officer, but he assigned it to Koenders and the B1, Reinders and Koenders, the man who had worked in Suriname from the late 60s, who had spent years building the Suriname files, was called back into action on the day those files became urgent. So what made Koenders irreplaceable wasn't just his whole knowledge of the network and what was going on. It was his institutional position. So Dutch historian Ellen Klinkers, who's considered a leading authority on the colonial and post-colonial history of Suriname, has documented what Section 2 Trees actually was beneath its official function. So according to Klinkers, Section 2 served as the local branch of the SAZ, which we've talked about before in the Gladio episode. It's specifically the Dutch version of the Stay Behind organization, specifically because it had spent years identifying the reliable individuals inside of Surinamese society who could be trusted in case stuff hit the fan. Because Section 2 had spent all these years watching Surinamese society for subversive, see anti-communist, Cuban, communist kind of elements, they were perfect partners for these secret planners. So Klinkers notes that Section 2 Trees provided the SAZ with intelligence framework necessary to identify reliable individuals for potential stay-behind network. by promoting security-mindedness and the monitoring of political reliability. So the SAZ wasn't just a Cold War contingency plan, it was an infrastructure of relationships built one conversation at a time over a decade, filed in the memory of the people inside of that institution that had survived Surinamese independence. So Koenders had built part of that infrastructure. He knew what names were in what files. And that's a detail that doesn't appear a whole lot in the official records. So one of the other operatives who had worked in Section 2 Trees framework in the late 1960s, monitoring Polish fishermen and filing reports on teachers' strike, was a young Dutch martial arts instructor named Peter van Happeren. He would tell Belgian instructors years later that his Suriname service was where he was first recruited for de dienst, the service. So it's the espionage branch of O&I operations, part of the Foreign Intelligence Service that he explicitly identified as, quote, what would later become known as Dutch Gladio. So the SR2 Trace network had not just produced the files, it had produced operatives, and Koenders knew which ones. So there was also a secondary objective that doesn't appear in the official record. Section 2 Trace had a specific function beyond collecting intelligence, which was, quote, preventing negative publicity about Trace in the Surinamese press. So they sent a former S2 man whose prior job was narrative management. In America, we call them spin doctors, to investigate a coup his own institution had its fingerprints on. So the investigation and the cover story had arrived in the exact same Koenders briefcase. Now, at the time the investigation started, Schulte was leading the Intelligence and Security Department. However, there's a little bit of irony here, because just months after ordering Koenders to find the truth, Schulte received a promotion. On January 1st, 1981, he officially became the head of Army Intelligence Service, LAMID. So the man who had asked the questions was now in charge of the answers. And by the time Koenders had finished his report, proving that the Dutch military had their fingerprints all over the coup, Schulte was in the perfect position to protect his political friends. He didn't need a complex conspiracy, he just needed 2 words: file it. Months later, he would be flying to Washington to convince the Americans and Alcoa to support Bouterse. But first, though, before we get to that, what did Koenders actually find? When the dust all settled, Valk didn't hide his involvement. He had the audacity to appear at military headquarters wearing full dress uniform, a sign of an official capacity, formal recognition, and state backing. Diplomatic protocols are pretty specific about when military attachés wear their full dress. This wasn't a courtesy call. This was a statement, especially for someone like Valk, you can see in pictures, like to be kind of loose and unbuttoned. And Lieutenant Michel Van Rey, one of the coup leaders, he made a pretty extraordinary offer. And in an interview with Trouw newspaper, Van Rey said plainly, Colonel Valk is a competent officer who has a warm heart for Suriname. We have no problem with Valk getting important powers in the future, if he so desires. So important powers in the new military government. Journalists at the time expressed surprise. Surely a Dutch officer couldn't serve in Suriname's military, but Van Rey dismissed the concern. The nationality issue, we'll settle that matter for ourselves. They wanted Valk to stay. They wanted him to run the military. The man who'd given operational coaching 3 days before the coup, they wanted him as the commander. So think about what that means for a second. The coup plotters didn't just appreciate Valk's support, they wanted to formalize it. They wanted to give him important powers in the new regime, to work around the whole nationality issue and to keep him in command. And this matches the way Bouterse worked. He loved to reward loyalty. Valk declined, but the offer itself tells you everything you need to know about how central his role had been. Then came the Parliamentary investigation. So the Fort Bomika audio recording reached the Netherlands. The journalist who had recorded Valk giving operational advice to the coup plotters 3 days before the coup, the recording still existed at that time. The evidence was physical, and questions were raised in Parliament. The PPR member of Parliament, Valtmans, wrote the government demanding clarification regarding the possible influence that the head of the Dutch mission in Suriname, Colonel Valk, had on the coup. The article published in Trouw on March 12th had detailed the tape recording conversation. It showed Valk voicing harsh criticism of the leadership of the Surinamese armed forces, alleging that SS-like conditions prevailed. His statements were right there, attributed to him directly and preserved on tape. So the Ministry of Defense initially declined to comment. They were waiting to hear from Valk himself, who would be in the Netherlands next week for debriefing. Then the government started an investigation. They reviewed the tape. They examined the evidence. They interviewed the witnesses. They assessed Valk's February 22nd visit to Fort Bomika 3 days before the coup. They examined his February 25th and 26th appearance in full dress uniform at military headquarters immediately after. They considered Van Rey's offer to give him important powers in the new regime. And the conclusion that was delivered to Parliament was that Valk had acted clumsily but had not incited a coup. Clumsy, not incitement. So the tape recorded conversation that not to take a step back, just clumsy. The Nuremberg defense framing, clumsy. The full dress uniform appearance, clumsy. Van Rey's offer of important powers, that's just talk. Case closed. Tell that to Dick Staphorst, though. The man who had kept his oath, Bouterse's old friend and mentor who had been through the training in Hualan, who had wrestled with him on the judo mat, who had pushed back at Valk, who said, "Was your officer's oath more valuable than mine?" He paid for that loyalty the moment that the coup succeeded. When he refused to join the new regime, Sergeant Paul Bagwandes, Bouterse's old neighbor, turned his attention to Staphorst. The torture was severe enough to put him in the hospital. Bouterse didn't pay him a visit. His former mentor, the man who taught him how to fall and throw on the judo mat, the man who coached him at Hualan, spent nights drinking with him at the bars, lay in a hospital bed, and Bouterse sent no one. The sweet demeanor Staphorst remembered in Bouterse was gone. When colleagues described instead was a sullen look in his eyes, heavily armed with Uzis, a changed man. Being clumsy also meant that Lieutenant Van Alst and Sergeant Major Koenvalius and Officer Mohammed Ramjan Sultan and Joseph Bacchus lay dead. Van Alst was the officer on duty at the barracks while 7 NCOs cut through the fence and forced their way through the compound. He resisted. Bagwandes shot him, and Parliament called that clumsy, and Bagwandes just called it a Monday. Okay, let's wrap this up. So, June 1980, 3 months after the coup, Valk's pre-scheduled transfer to Brussels. I think that's important to know because sometimes when you see a man who leaves a country quickly after a coup that he's being blamed for things for, it looks pretty bad on paper. But he was actually scheduled to leave to Brussels before that had happened. So the move had been planned since February. Standard rotation. They already had the paperwork in play for all of it. But Ambassador Wegelin had been lobbying to get Valk out of there for months before the coup, calling him undisciplined and alarmist. So the Ministry of Defense had refused. They decided to let Valk finish out his contract to avoid drawing additional attention to the embassy's internal dysfunction and squabbling. And after the coup, Bouterse tried to keep him, writing letters claiming that Valk's departure would be destabilizing to Suriname. So the Dutch government refused again. So they had refused to allow Marsevain to be there, and now they were refusing to allow Valk to stay. So when Valk finally departed on June 18th, the optics were pretty impossible to control. You had a Dutch colonel who advises coup plotters. The coup succeeds. The new regime publicly begs him to stay. The colonel transfers to NATO headquarters. Pre-scheduled or not, it looked exactly what critics said it was. Reward or cover-up. Take your pick. So after the dust settled, the Dutch had a serious problem on their hands. An element in their organization had helped create a military government in Paramaribo. Whether it was deliberate or through catastrophic negligence, the result was still the same. They needed to figure out how to control it. And their first strategy was pretty simply throw money at the problem. Lots of money. Shortly after February 25th, the Netherlands transferred 500 million Dutch guilders to the new regime. So roughly $200 million in 1980 dollars, about $750 million today for a country of 350,000 people, which is a small town in some countries. So the unofficial designation was development age for an urgency program. In actual function, it was political leverage. The Dutch goal was straightforward: strengthen the civilian government under Prime Minister Henk Chennassen, promote the restoration of democracy, and push the military back into the barracks. Use money to make the sergeants irrelevant. Get the genie back in the bottle. But in Suriname, both the supporters and the opponents of the coup saw this as this financial massive injection of capital in the same way, as a reward, direct support for the new regime and the legitimization of the coup. So within weeks of the sergeant seizing power at gunpoint, the former colonial power transfers $750 million. That's not subtle diplomacy. That's a message. And even Bouterse acknowledged it years later. He said, I initially received 500 million guilders. Initially. So the Dutch strategy rested on a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that financial dependency would create political compliance. In other words, they thought they could buy off Bouterse, get him to heel, but it didn't. Bouterse later explained the relationship soured when The Hague realized that his government, was unwilling to be controlled, not willing to cooperate, unwilling to negotiate, unwilling to be controlled. So the 500 million guilders was supposed to be leverage, a golden leash. Instead, it became operating capital for a military regime that had no intention on returning to the barracks. The sergeants used the money, but they didn't take the orders. So despite this civilian facade, everybody understood the reality. The actual power remained with the men with the guns and the Uzis walking around town, the sergeants. The money hadn't shifted the dynamics, it had reinforced it. The military now controlled both the guns and the treasury. And the Dutch had just financed the very entrenchment that they were trying to prevent. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about what we actually covered in these last two episodes. I want to make sure that it lands before we move on. In part one, we watched a Dutch colonel drink whiskey with the men who had just overthrown the Surinamese government. We traced these men on the judo mat, one who trained the dictator, another who fled on the day of the coup, one who disappeared into resistance for 40 years. We watched a sports instructor selling Surinamese Viagra get recruited into history by a man who couldn't stop knocking at his door. And in this episode, we got all forensic on things. We looked at 4 days before the coup. We looked at two senior Dutch officers who both had identical alibis covering the same 4-hour window, an ambassador whose departure route doesn't make sense to the conference that he claimed that he was attending, who 30 years later looked at camera and said, I had things to do abroad. And that's not the answer of a man who knew what conference that he had attended. We looked at an armory that just happened to be unlocked and broken armored vehicles that just got fixed right in the nick of time and were somehow an American aircraft, top secret 3 aircrafts with a crew of 65 people arrived right when the coup was erupting, just in time to transmit real-time signals back to the State Department, who kept the Dutch embassy in the loop while the coup was still in progress. We watched a colonel who had spent years cultivating a young sergeant walk into a farewell party and hear that sergeant raise a glass to him and say, "Without you, Colonel, none of this could have taken place." And he did not object, right? They thought that they could create financial dependency through hundreds of millions of guilders, and that just bought them a military regime who took the money and never took the orders. So in episode 9 that comes next, what happens, we're going to find out when people who built this machine realize that it's running without them. When a colonel gets sent to clean things up in Marseveen, and he gets humiliated at a tea ceremony. When the investigator Koenders, who writes the most damning report in Dutch intelligence history, watches it just disappear into a desk drawer. Or what happens when the only man who may be telling the truth gets a psychiatric team waiting for him at the Schiphol airport. So episode 9 is called The Buried Report. It's all about what happens to people who find out too much and the institutional machinery that exists specifically to make sure that they can't tell anybody. It's also about the moment that a Dutch policy stopped being about Suriname and started being about preventing the Americans from invading it. And a 70-year-old retired Dutch sergeant major who was sent back to Paramaribo on a secret mission that his wife didn't even know about, and about 400 pistols that were supposed to be shipped to the People's Militia and ended up in the wrong hands on the worst night in Surinamese history. We are deep into this story now, and I got to be honest with you, the further that we go, the more extraordinary this becomes. And the research has been incredible. The tips that you've been sending in, man, I cannot tell you how much those mean. Several of you have pointed to sources that we didn't have, to archives that we've now checked out, and to connections we hadn't made before. So you're not just watching the series, you all are participating in it, and that's genuinely something that I don't take for granted. So if you haven't already subscribed, please do. Hit the like button so you get the notification bell. You actually see when the next episode drops. The algorithm is not doing us any favors on that front, so we really need your help. Leave a comment. Let me know what's working here. Let me know what you want to hear more about or what you think that we've missed. Those conversations in the comments are some of the best I have. So the material coming up is extraordinary, and we're moving toward the December murders, and everything we've spent 8 episodes now building is pointing toward that night. So every handler relationship, every buried report, every choice that was made to look the other way, it all leads somewhere. I'm Matthew Smith. This is the Suriname Contra affair. Thank you for being here. We'll see you soon on episode 9.